They thought they had found $90 million underwater and that their poor lives were over in a single moment. But one night in the ocean turned their dream into a nightmare and forced a choice none of them would ever forget. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you're watching this story from. The horizon was a flat wound of steel, a line where the color of the sea bled directly into the sky with no mercy in between. There were mornings when the ocean at least pretended to be kind, spreading a veil of pale blue or silver over the water. But this was not one of those mornings. Today, the Atlantic carried the heavy breath of something unresolved, a silence that felt less like calm and more like restraint. The trawler cut through it like an insect dragging a broken wing behind itself, coughing diesel smoke into the low clouds as if trying to prove that it was still alive. The vessel had no name anyone could read anymore. Whatever letters had once been painted on the hull had long ago surrendered to rust and salt. The paint peeled in overlapping scales, revealing layers of forgotten colors beneath, each one a failed promise of repair. Along the waterline ran a dark seam where the metal had been welded back together more times than anyone cared to count. Those seams were the scars of storms survived, of nights when the sea had climbed the sides of the ship like a predator, searching for any weakness. The trawler answered each year with a few more plates of steel bolted into place, like patches on a beggar's coat. Inside, the corridors were narrow enough that two men could not pass without turning sideways. The air carried a permanent mix of fuel, wet rope, and old fish that no amount of bleach ever managed to erase. The crew moved through these passages with the slow rhythm of exhaustion, shoulders brushing bulkheads, hands instinctively reaching for the rails whenever the ship lurched. They were men held together not by hope but by necessity, each of them clinging to this floating carcass because there was nowhere else to go. The galley was barely large enough for 3 people to stand at once, yet on this morning 5 crowded in, passing around mugs of coffee so bitter it felt medicinal. There was no laughter, no jokes about the weather or the catch. Their talk, when it surfaced at all, hovered around the same subjects it always did: bills that would not wait, children who had outgrown their coats, houses that were no longer theirs in spirit even if the bank had not yet taken them in law. They had all learned to measure time not in weeks or months, but in how long they could delay the inevitable phone call from a creditor. Marcus stood slightly apart from the rest, leaning one hand against the frame of the galley door while the trawler swayed beneath him. He was taller than most of the crew, his build still strong despite the years that had settled into his joints. His face bore the map of a man who had lived too much under open skies, lines carved deep by sun and salt, eyes dark and alert in a way that had nothing to do with youth. When the vessel groaned, he did not flinch. His balance adjusted before his mind ever seemed to register the movement. He had come to the sea young, chasing a version of freedom that only exists before you understand its cost. In those days, he had believed storms were challenges to be beaten, not reminders of mortality. That illusion had ended one winter night more than 2 decades earlier, when a freak wave had torn a deckhand from the rail right in front of him. Marcus still remembered the sound, not a scream, but a short, stunned breath, as if the man had not yet accepted that the ocean had chosen him. There had been no body to bury. Only a name carved into a board back home and a silence that had never fully lifted from Marcus's chest. That was why the others watched him when the weather shifted. He did not speak often about what he saw in the clouds or the water, but when he moved with sudden purpose, they followed. It was not superstition. It was survival, learned the hard way. The captain came into the galley last, wiping his hands on a rag that had once been white. His name was Frank Calder, though few ever used it. He carried his authority the way the trawler carried its rust, not as something imposed, but as something accumulated through years of refusing to give up. His beard had more gray than brown now, and his eyes, once sharp as glass, had dulled into a tired blue that betrayed how many nights he spent staring at spreadsheets instead of charts. They all knew the truth he never said out loud. One more bad season would finish them. The company that owned the boat had already begun asking questions about whether it was worth keeping her afloat. The engine drank fuel like a dying animal, the nets tore more often than they held, and every port inspector left a little closer to grounding the vessel for good. If that happened, the crew would scatter, each man carrying his own small failure back to shore. That was why no one suggested turning back when the first signs of bad weather crept into the day. The barometer fell, the wind sharpened its edge, but the nets were already in the water and the holds were still too empty to justify retreat. They worked in silence, muscles remembering motions their minds no longer wanted to repeat. When the trawler pitched, they tightened their grips and leaned into it. The sea did not care about their debts or their families. It only respected weight, momentum, and the cruel mathematics of chance. Marcus stepped out onto the deck as the clouds thickened overhead, a single dark sheet drawn slowly across the sky. The smell of rain had not yet reached them, but something colder rode the wind. He scanned the surface, not looking for waves so much as for patterns. The ocean had a language all its own, one he had spent his life learning, and right now it was whispering a warning. He made his way toward the nets, checking the lines with a thoroughness that irritated some of the younger men. To them, it looked like superstition, a man trying to hold back the weather with habit. To Marcus, it was a form of prayer. Each knot was a small agreement with fate. Each inspection a way of telling the sea that he was paying attention. Behind him, the trawler continued its slow, stubborn progress, the engine vibrating up through the soles of his boots. He felt the pulse of it, like a second heart, one that could stop at any time without warning. Somewhere in the hull, water dripped steadily into a bucket, the sound too quiet to be heard over the machinery but loud enough in Marcus's mind. He had asked the captain to fix that leak twice already. The captain had nodded both times, eyes flicking away in embarrassment because they both knew there was no money left for proper repairs. By mid-morning, the light had gone completely. What little sun had filtered through the clouds was smothered under layers of gray, and the sea had taken on a darker hue, as if someone had stirred ink into it. The wind rose in irregular gusts, snapping at jackets and tearing spray from the wave crests. Marcus felt the shift in his bones before the radio crackled with the first warning from the coast. The others were slower to acknowledge what was coming. They were fishermen, hardened to bad weather, and the sea had fooled them before with false threats that never materialized. But Marcus saw the way the swells were beginning to stack, one climbing onto the back of another instead of spreading out. That was not a storm that passed over a vessel. That was a storm that stopped and chose it. He moved to the wheelhouse, catching the captain's eye through the glass. They did not exchange words. Frank simply nodded once, his mouth tightening as he adjusted their heading. It was too late to run for shelter, but they could at least try to meet the waves at a better angle. The trawler creaked as if in protest, her aging joints complaining about every degree of turn. Below deck, the men secured loose gear, the familiar ritual of impending trouble. Drawers were latched, crates wedged, ropes coiled and tied off in patterns learned through muscle memory rather than thought. There was a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with humidity. It was the weight of unspoken fears pressing against each rib cage. When the first wall of water struck, it did not announce itself with drama. It arrived as a blunt force, a deep thud that shuddered through the hull and sent a cascade of spray over the rails. The trawler staggered, recovering slowly, and for a heartbeat there was a fragile sense that perhaps this would be manageable. Then came the next wave, taller and more determined, and the illusion vanished. The deck tilted sharply, tools skittering across the metal, a crate of frozen bait breaking loose and slamming into the bulkhead. Someone shouted, a short, involuntary sound ripped free by fear. Marcus grabbed the nearest rail and felt the ship lurch beneath him, felt the ocean's grip tighten as if it had been waiting all along. In that moment, he did not think about money or failure or the quiet dread of going home empty-handed. He thought about balance, about weight, about how thin the line was between motion and disaster. He had the sudden, unreasonable sense that the sea was not merely angry, but curious, as if it were reaching out to see how much this broken vessel could endure. The storm had not yet shown its full face. It was only clearing its throat, preparing to speak in a voice that would drown out every other concern. And somewhere ahead, unseen and unimaginable, the ocean was already hiding the thing that would test them in ways none of them were prepared to face. The first waves had only been a warning, a clearing of the ocean's throat before it began to speak in earnest. Now, the sea found its voice. The trawler no longer moved through water so much as fought against it, every forward meter stolen rather than given. Wind slammed into the vessel from shifting angles, sometimes from the side, sometimes head-on, as if the storm itself could not decide the quickest way to tear them apart. The air was so thick with spray that breathing felt like swallowing the ocean one mouthful at a time. Marcus held the rail with both hands, his knuckles pale beneath the grime, and forced his gaze to stay open. He had learned long ago that panic crept in through the edges of vision, through the small moments when you closed your eyes to escape what was happening. He watched the deck instead, every bolt and plate etched into memory so that when the ship heaved, he already knew which way it would go. The radio crackled uselessly in the wheelhouse, voices from the coast smeared into static by the storm. Captain Frank Calder leaned over the chart table, one hand braced against the wall, the other clenched around the microphone he had long since stopped trying to use. He was not praying. He had passed that stage years ago. What he was doing now was calculating, weighing impossible options in a mind that no longer had room for hope. Below him the engine screamed like a wounded animal. Its rhythm faltered, then recovered, then faltered again, each hesitation a small reminder of how much depended on aging metal and borrowed parts. The trawler had been designed for a different era, when profit margins were wider and storms were not amplified by a climate that no longer followed old rules. Out here, it was no longer a vessel, but a question, asking the sea how much longer it would be allowed to exist. The crew moved as one despite the chaos, a choreography born of repetition rather than trust. Nets were hauled in not because the catch mattered, but because leaving them out was an invitation to disaster. Every pull was a gamble, the cables singing under tension, vibrating through the deck and into their bones. The trawler pitched so violently that men had to crawl on hands and knees to reach the winches, fingers numb as they fumbled with wet steel. Marcus was at the nets when the weight changed. At first it was subtle, nothing more than a slight resistance where there should have been give. He leaned into the line, feeling it through the soles of his boots, the way a blind man might feel a shape with his fingertips. Fish had a particular pull, a chaotic flutter that spread unevenly through the cable. Kelp was heavier, more stubborn, but still familiar. This was neither. This was solid, dead weight, the kind that did not fight back because it did not need to. The trawler shuddered as the winch strained, its motor protesting with a grinding whine that cut through the roar of the storm. The cable straightened into a rigid line, so tight it looked like it might slice the air in two. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Whatever they had caught was not meant to be caught by a fishing net. He signaled to the nearest man, then to another, his gestures sharp and economical. They adjusted their grips, bracing themselves against the sudden tension. Somewhere behind them a bolt snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and the cable jerked violently, nearly tearing free of the winch. One of the younger crew members lost his footing and slid across the deck until Marcus caught him by the collar, hauling him back from the edge. They could have cut the line then. It would have been the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. Let the ocean keep whatever prize it was offering. But after months of empty holds and mounting debts, sense had become a luxury they no longer afforded. The winch continued its tortured pull, inch by inch dragging something massive up from the depths. The surface of the sea bulged before them, water erupting in a churn of white foam. For a moment, Marcus thought the net had snagged on a reef or a sunken wreck, some forgotten piece of history refusing to stay buried. Then a corner broke through the waves, not the jagged edge of rock, but a slab of rusted metal, blunt and unmistakably manufactured. The trawler lurched as the weight shifted, the sudden emergence of that iron mass altering the balance of the vessel. Men shouted warnings that were lost almost immediately to the wind. Marcus tightened his grip, muscles burning as he adjusted to the new rhythm of movement. The object rose further, shedding sheets of water, revealing a rectangular face pocked with corrosion and scars. It was a shipping container, not the kind meant for this world of nets and salt and bleeding hands, but one of those standardized boxes that belong to a universe of ports and cranes and contracts written in clean offices far from the smell of fish. Its paint had long ago been eaten away, leaving only ghostly traces of logos that might once have proclaimed ownership. The corners were bent, the door warped, but the container remained whole in a way that felt almost defiant. The sight of it stole the breath from every man on deck. In the midst of the storm, with the ocean clawing at their boots, the container looked like an intruder from another reality, something that had no business existing in this place. It swung beneath the trawler like a pendulum, the net cradling it awkwardly as if unsure what to do with such an alien burden. Bringing it aboard was madness, and they all knew it. The deck was already slick with rain, the vessel already straining to keep its balance. A container of that size could crush a man flat with a single uncontrolled swing, yet one by one they moved to secure it, ropes flying through the air, hooks finding purchase in corroded seams. The trawler groaned as if in pain, protesting the added weight. A wave rose without warning, a wall of dark water that struck the container and sent it crashing into the hull. The impact reverberated through the ship, a metallic thunder that rattled teeth and bones alike. The container rebounded, its lower edge scraping along the side of the vessel, tearing away a strip of rust and paint as it went. Someone cried out, more in awe than fear. They wrestled it onto the deck in a series of desperate, improvised movements, the storm offering no pauses in which to think. The container finally came to rest at an awkward angle, wedged between the railing and the winch assembly, held in place by a tangle of ropes and sheer luck. Water pooled around its base, the deck struggling to drain fast enough to keep up with the rain. Marcus stood over it, chest heaving, the cold rain running down his face in rivulets. He had seen debris dragged up before, bits of wreckage, lost buoys, once even the twisted frame of a small boat that no one had ever claimed. This was different. This was too intact, too deliberate. His gaze traced the edges of the container, noting the shape of the locks, the remains of straps that were not part of any fishing gear. This thing had not simply fallen from a ship. It had been bound, secured, prepared for travel. The others were not thinking about any of that. They were staring at the container as if it had just washed ashore in a desert, a miracle shaped like steel. For a few heartbeats the storm receded from their awareness, the roar of the wind fading behind the sudden thrum of possibility. Even the captain had come down from the wheelhouse, his eyes fixed on the box with a look that mingled disbelief and something dangerously close to relief. They tried to move it, to shift it into a safer position, but the container resisted every effort, its mass anchoring it to the deck as stubbornly as if it had grown there. When one man slipped and slammed his knee into the metal, he barely noticed the pain. All around them the storm continued its assault, but the crew's attention had narrowed to that single object, that iron ghost dragged up from a place it had never been meant to leave. Marcus knelt and ran his fingers over a series of gouges near the corner, marks left by thick cables that had once held it fast. He followed them to a snapped shackle half embedded in the rust, its break too clean to be the work of time alone. Something had torn this container free, something strong enough to rip it from wherever it had been secured. He straightened slowly, his gaze lifting to the gray chaos above. The storm howled, waves smashing into the hull with renewed fury, but he barely felt it now. A sense of unease had settled into his gut, heavier than the container itself. The ocean did not give things back without reason. When it did, it was usually because it had already taken what it wanted in return. Around him, the crew began to shout over the wind, gesturing excitedly, already speculating about what might lie inside. Marcus heard none of it clearly, only the rising pitch of voices that told him the ship had just crossed a line it would not be able to step back from. He placed a hand against the cold metal of the container, feeling the faint vibration of the trawler travel through it, and for the first time since the storm had begun, he wished they had cut the line and let the sea keep its secret. The storm did not end simply because the container was now on deck. It continued to hurl itself against the trawler with the stubbornness of a creature insulted by having one of its trophies taken away. Rain fell in sheets that blurred the boundary between sea and sky. Yet the crew gathered around the iron mass as if it were a hearth, their backs forming a crooked circle of human shields against the wind. For the first time in hours, their movements were not dictated solely by survival but by curiosity, and that subtle shift was enough to change the entire character of the ship. They did not open it at once. The container sat there, bleeding rust into the water pooling around its base, a mute presence that seemed to absorb the light around it. The trawler's engine labored on, and the captain shouted instructions that were only half obeyed as men found excuses to linger near the box, to brush a hand across its corroded surface as though it might warm them. It was absurd, Marcus thought, how quickly need reshaped the mind. A few hours earlier, they had been fighting for breath. Now they were circling a piece of dead metal as if it had a pulse. When the door finally cracked open, it was not with a triumphant clang, but with a drawn-out groan that seemed to echo the trawler's own complaints. Someone had found a crowbar in the tool locker and driven it between the warped seams, prying with a desperation that bordered on violence. The door resisted, then gave way by inches, releasing a breath of air that smelled nothing like the sea. It was dry, faintly chemical, the scent of warehouses and cardboard rather than fish and diesel. A beam of light from a deck lamp pierced the darkness inside, illuminating the first layer of its contents. It took a moment for their eyes to make sense of what they were seeing. The storm had trained them to expect debris, soaked fabric, ruined cargo. Instead, the light caught on smooth surfaces, on protective plastic still intact, on the dull gleam of metal that had never known salt. Someone reached in and pulled out a handbag encased in clear wrapping, its shape unmistakable even through the film. The sound that escaped the crew was not a cheer. It was closer to a collective exhale, the kind that comes when the body realizes it has been holding its breath without noticing. More packages followed, stacked in neat rows as if waiting patiently for a different kind of voyage. Boxes marked with brand logos that meant nothing to the sea but everything to the world they had left behind. Watches nestled in velvet trays, heavy packets that clinked softly when they were lifted, the muted music of gold. For a few suspended seconds, no one spoke. The storm's roar filled the silence, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt like a distant audience to a miracle. Each man saw his own reflection in those objects, not in the polished metal, but in the futures they represented. Marcus watched their faces change as if someone were turning dials behind their eyes. Lines of fatigue softened, jaws unclenched. A man who had spent the morning coughing blood into a rag laughed suddenly, a raw, disbelieving sound torn free by shock. Marcus felt it too, the pull of possibility tightening around his chest. He pictured his kitchen at home, the cracked linoleum that peeled up at the corners, the way his youngest had learned to step over it without being told. He saw his wife counting coins at the table, doing the math aloud as if speaking it might somehow make the numbers kinder. This cargo could end that. It could erase years of strain in a single, unreal gesture. That was when the fear arrived. It was not the sharp fear of a wave breaking over the deck or a cable snapping under tension. It was quieter, more corrosive. He had seen enough of the world beyond the sea to recognize that wealth rarely traveled alone. There were documents inside the container, too, tucked into waterproof cases, papers stamped and initialed in languages he did not fully understand. He handled one briefly, feeling the thickness of it through the glove, the seriousness of its weight. These were not the leftovers of a shipwreck. They were the tools of a transaction that had not yet finished. He straightened and cleared his throat, though the sound vanished immediately into the wind. Still, he spoke, or tried to, forcing his mouth to shape words about caution, about how this kind of cargo belonged to someone powerful enough to look for it. He gestured toward the cases, toward the absence of any shipping marks, toward the clean dryness of the interior. His message was simple even without sound. This was not theirs to keep. The reaction was not hostile at first. It was dismissive, the way a starving man dismisses a lecture about moderation. They were cold, soaked, bruised, and suddenly surrounded by things that had never known hardship. A younger crewman held up a watch to the deck lamp, watching the light play across its face as if it were a living creature. Another tugged a handbag free of its wrapping and slung it over his shoulder in a parody of elegance that would have been funny if it had not cut so deep. Someone clapped Marcus on the shoulder in what might have been a friendly gesture in another context. It felt now like a benediction, a wordless suggestion that he should relax and let the miracle be a miracle. The captain watched all of this with an expression that Marcus could not read. Frank Calder was not a fool. He knew the risks as well as Marcus did, but he also knew the numbers, the debts, the quiet way the world was closing in on them. They tried to inventory the cargo, to impose order on the chaos of discovery, but the storm allowed no neat lists. Packages slid across the deck when the trawler rolled, and more than once a box burst open, spilling its contents into the pooling water. Men lunged to retrieve them, curses flying, hands closing possessively around objects that were not yet and might never be theirs. It was in those moments that the first fractures appeared. A watch went missing, then reappeared on a wrist where it had not been a minute before. Someone accused someone else of pocketing a gold bar, and though the accusation was shrugged off with forced laughter, it did not dissolve. It hung in the air like a stain, visible to everyone even when no one pointed at it. Marcus found himself standing guard by the open container almost without realizing he had moved there. He did not frame it to himself as guarding. It was simply the only place he could stand and still feel that he was doing something right. He closed the door part way, trying to protect the contents from the rain as much as from the hands that reached for them. He imagined explaining all of this later to a port authority, to a man in a dry office who would never understand why they had not simply cut the line and let the ocean keep its prize. The storm eased slightly in the late afternoon, enough to allow the trawler to steady its course. That, more than the cargo itself, emboldened the crew. With the worst of the waves behind them, they began to talk not about survival, but about return. About ports that were not their usual haunts, quiet harbors where no one would ask too many questions. The words were tossed casually, as if they were only hypotheticals, but Marcus could hear the hunger in them. By evening, the ship felt different. The air inside was warmer despite the weather, charged with the kind of electricity that comes when men believe their lives are about to change. They ate together in the galley, hands still shaking from the day, and for the first time in weeks the food was not discussed as a burden, but as a celebration. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey that had been hidden away for emergencies, and it was passed around with a reverence usually reserved for prayer. Marcus did not drink. He watched instead, measuring the speed at which the mood was shifting. He thought of the snapped shackle he had seen on the container, of the gouges in the metal where thick cables had once held it fast. He imagined the ship or dock that had lost this cargo, the men who would have to answer for it. The sea had a way of erasing things. People, though, were less forgiving. That night, he lay in his narrow bunk, listening to the trawler's familiar symphony of groans and drips, but beneath it, he heard another rhythm, subtler and far more dangerous. It was the sound of possibility being converted into expectation. The container no longer promised a life. It demanded one, and Marcus feared that the price would not be paid in money. The night after the container was opened did not belong to sleep. It lay over the trawler like a film of oil, coating every sound, every breath, until even the familiar creaks of the hull seemed altered, as if the ship itself were unsure what kind of vessel it had become. The storm had weakened but not departed. It hovered in the distance, a restless animal circling the campfire of human greed that now burned in the heart of the deck. The trawler had always been a cramped place, but never had its narrow corridors felt so unforgiving. Men passed each other sideways in the passageways, their shoulders brushing metal, eyes sliding away at the last moment. Where once such contact had been met with a muttered apology or a tired joke, now it sparked flinches and sharp intakes of breath. Privacy had never existed here, yet suddenly everyone was hiding something. Marcus moved through this changed world like a ghost, careful to touch nothing that did not need touching, to speak only when absolutely required. He had closed the container door as best he could, lashing it shut with ropes that were meant to hold nets rather than secrets. Even so, he could feel its presence, a weight that was not measured in tons but in altered glances and restless hands. The crew began to fracture almost immediately, not in dramatic declarations but in the subtle shifts that betray a break in mind. In the galley, two men who had shared bunks for years now sat at opposite ends of the table, eating in silence, their shoulders angled defensively as if a line had been drawn between their plates. On deck, small knots formed and dissolved, conversations dropped into whispers whenever someone new approached. It was not long before the first accusation surfaced, and it came, as Marcus had expected, over something almost trivial. A watch was missing, one of the smaller ones, hardly noticeable among the glittering piles they had begun to reorganize in the hold. Its absence might have been chalked up to misplacement, if not for the way it had been discovered, with a suddenness that felt rehearsed. A man stood up from his crate in the middle of sorting and announced the loss, his voice pitched just high enough to carry through the ship. No one answered him at first. Then someone laughed too loudly and suggested the watch had slid under a pallet. Hands began to move, not to search, but to adjust sleeves, to tug cuffs into place, to protect wrists that now felt exposed. Marcus watched it unfold with a sense of inevitability. The watch was found eventually, tucked behind a bundle of handbags, but the damage was done. The question had been asked. Who among them had already decided to take what could be taken? The answer, Marcus knew, was all of them. Even himself, though he refused to admit it. He felt the tug every time he passed the container, the whisper in his head that insisted he could take just one thing, something small enough not to be missed, something that would not tip the scales. He imagined slipping a gold bar into his duffel and telling himself it was only insurance, a hedge against a future that had already betrayed him too many times. He did not do it, but the thought alone left him ashamed. By morning, the ship no longer belonged to Captain Calder in any meaningful sense. Frank still issued orders, his voice hoarse from shouting over the storm, but they carried less weight now. The men obeyed out of habit rather than respect, their attention divided between the labor of keeping the trawler afloat and the silent calculus of what they believed they were owed. When Frank tried to reorganize the work schedule, a simple act meant to restore order, he was met with blank stares that lingered a moment too long. Two distinct camps emerged, though no one named them aloud. There were those who spoke openly of turning toward a smaller port, one without the rigid inspections of their usual harbor, a place where cargo could change hands without too many questions. They were the men whose debts were deepest, whose eyes gleamed with a reckless light that Marcus recognized from too many bars and betting halls. For them, the container was not a miracle, but a deadline. They could almost feel the cash in their palms, warm and final. Opposite them were the cautious ones, fewer in number, who argued for contacting the authorities once they were safely ashore. They spoke in measured tones about legal obligations and the dangers of trafficking, about the way ships disappeared when they interfered with business that did not belong to them. Marcus stood with them, though he did not make a show of it. He knew how quickly reason was dismissed in a room full of hunger. Between these two poles drifted the rest, men who said little but listened to everything, weighing each argument against their own private needs. It was among them that the most dangerous energy brewed, the kind that does not announce itself until it has already decided what it wants. The container itself became a locus of power. Access to it was no longer a matter of convenience, but of control. Someone had begun a crude system of guarding it, 2 men at a time lingering nearby under the pretense of organizing the hold. They'd change shifts without being asked, sometimes staying longer than scheduled, their bodies forming a living barricade that had nothing to do with safety. Marcus noticed that the ropes he had used to secure the door were retied differently every time he returned. The knots altered, the slack adjusted. It was a quiet way of telling him that the container was no longer his responsibility, that whatever authority he had claimed over it was being steadily eroded. When he confronted one of the guards, the man only shrugged, eyes sliding past Marcus to the deck beyond, as if the question had not been worth the effort of an answer. The atmosphere thickened with every mile they put between themselves and the place where they had found the container. They were sailing now, not just away from the storm, but toward a future that no longer had a shared shape. Even the ocean seemed to sense the shift. The waves, though calmer than before, struck the hull with an irregularity that kept everyone on edge, as if the sea itself were trying to dislodge the fragile new order taking root on the trawler. In the cramped passageways, old grievances resurfaced like bubbles from a disturbed seabed. A man accused another of having cheated him years ago on a shared job. Someone brought up a forgotten fight in a bar, a debt never repaid. The container gave all of it new relevance. Every slight was now a claim, every past insult a justification. Marcus kept mostly to himself, but he saw everything. He noticed the way one of the crew, a man named Keller, whose smile had always come too easily, lingered over the waterproof cases of documents longer than necessary, his fingers tracing the seals as if memorizing them. He saw another slip something small into his pocket during a bout of rough seas, his body blocking the view with a practiced ease that suggested experience. The captain tried to intervene, calling the crew together in the galley for what he framed as a safety briefing. He spoke about the dangers of the weather, about the need to remain focused, but the words bounced off a wall of half-concealed impatience. Men stared at the table or at their own hands. When Frank finally broached the subject of the container, urging restraint until they could make port, the response was a silence that felt more hostile than any argument. That silence followed Marcus as he left the galley. It wrapped around him in the corridor, in the engine room, in the small cabin where he lay awake later that night. He could feel the ship breathing around him, every creak a reminder that they were still alive, still together in the most literal sense. Yet he had never felt so isolated among these men. The sea outside had settled into a heavy swell, not yet another storm, but not peace either. Marcus stared at the ceiling above his bunk and listened to the water sliding along the hull. He thought about the gouges on the container, the broken shackle, the invisible hands that had lost it. He thought about the way his own had trembled when he held the watch earlier that day, the instinctive calculation of its worth even as he argued for caution. He knew then that the trawler had become something other than a workplace or a shelter. It was a closed system now, a pressure chamber where the smallest fracture could become catastrophic. The container had not brought them together as a gift. It had entered their lives like a wedge, forcing apart the seams that had held them for years. When he finally slept, it was not rest that claimed him, but exhaustion, the kind that steals consciousness without granting relief. In his dreams, the container sank slowly through black water, its doors opening as it fell, spilling gold that turned into bones before it reached the bottom. He woke before dawn with the taste of rust in his mouth and the certainty that the real storm was no longer outside the ship. It was inside, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be contained. The trawler slid into night like a wounded animal crawling into tall grass, not to heal, but to hide. The storm that had birthed the container had loosened its grip, yet the sea remained restless, rolling in broad, uneasy swells that lifted the hull and let it fall again with weary persistence. The deck lamps cast yellow islands of light across the wet metal, leaving long corridors of shadow where anything could be happening without witnesses. The men moved more quietly now, not out of discipline, but because silence felt safer, as if noise might summon something worse than the weather. Marcus sensed the change before he saw it. He had learned to read rooms the way he read water, by the tiny hesitations that crept into routine. People who had once stomped along the passageways now stepped softly. Doors were closed more often than they were left ajar. The laughter that had burst out after the container was opened had dried into short, brittle exhalations that ended almost before they began. He made a circuit of the deck shortly after midnight, not because it was his turn on watch, but because sleep had refused him. The container loomed in the hold, its outline barely visible beneath a tarpaulin that had been draped over it with more reverence than necessity. 2 men sat nearby on overturned crates, their silhouettes merging with the dark until Marcus was almost upon them. They greeted him with nods that were too quick, too stiff, their eyes tracking him in a way that made the hairs on his arms rise. Below deck, the ship was a maze of half-perceived movements. He heard someone shifting in the galley, a drawer opening and closing, the careful sound of glass being set back into place. In the engine room, the constant roar of machinery covered whatever else might have been happening, but even there he noticed a change. The maintenance logs that had once been scrawled in grease pencil now bore precise new entries, as if someone were trying to document a life they did not yet possess. The air felt heavy, thickened by unspoken plans. Marcus returned to his cabin, sat on the edge of his bunk, and forced himself to breathe slowly. He told himself he was imagining things, that fatigue was inventing enemies where there were only desperate men. Yet he could not shake the sense of being watched, of invisible eyes mapping his routines, calculating his vulnerabilities. It happened not long after 2 in the morning, though he never trusted the clock that much anymore. He had stepped out onto the deck again, drawn by the need for movement, when he felt the trawler change its rhythm beneath his feet. The swell was coming in at a new angle, nudging the ship sideways rather than lifting it cleanly. He paused near the railing, bracing himself, and that was when a hand struck him hard between the shoulders. The impact was not meant to kill him. It was meant to unbalance him, to make him stumble just far enough that the next wave would do the rest. The sea obliged immediately, surging against the hull and turning the deck into a tilted plane of slick metal. Marcus's boots lost purchase, and for a breathless instant the world narrowed to the roar of water and the shriek of the wind. He felt himself go over the rail. The cold was not a sensation so much as a verdict. It seized him in a full-body grip, punching the air from his lungs and replacing it with a liquid shock that stole all sense of up and down. He tumbled through darkness threaded with white foam, the surface vanishing above him as if it had never existed. Panic tried to take him then, a blind animal clawing at his throat, but he had met it too many times to surrender. He forced his body to still, counting heartbeats in his head until the spinning slowed. When he kicked, it was not upward, but in a direction he chose, angling himself through the chaos until his hand struck something solid. The hull was there, a black wall sliding past him, and he clawed at it with numb fingers until he found a ladder wrung slick with ice. He did not climb so much as drag himself up, muscles screaming as the weight of the sea fought to reclaim him. By the time his head broke the surface, he was choking, water streaming from his mouth in ragged bursts. Someone shouted his name from the deck, a sound that might have been concern or might have been disappointment. He could not tell. He lay on the deck for a long moment after hauling himself back over the rail, rain pooling in the hollows of his cheeks, the stars hidden behind layers of cloud. The men who had been nearby hovered just out of reach, their faces unreadable in the lamplight. No one admitted to seeing anything. No one asked who had pushed him. Marcus did not need their words. He saw the truth in their eyes, in the way they avoided his gaze while pretending to help him up, in the quickness with which they returned to their posts once he was standing. It had been an accident, they would say later, a misstep in bad weather. He let them have that story for the moment. He was not yet ready to tear the ship apart in search of justice. Shivering, he made his way below deck to change his soaked clothes. His hands trembled as he pulled off his jacket, and it was then that he noticed the sound coming from the hold. It was faint, masked by the engine, but unmistakable once he knew to listen for it. The metallic click of a latch being tested, the muted thud of a case being shifted. He moved without hesitation, slipping down the narrow stairs and along the corridor toward the container. The tarpaulin had been peeled back, folded with a care that had not been there before. One of the waterproof cases lay open on the deck, its contents spread around it in an untidy fan. Papers bearing seals and stamps he could not read, numbers scrawled in careful ink, a laminated card with a photograph that caught the light and reflected it back at him. A man crouched over the open case, his back to Marcus, hands moving too quickly to be innocent. He froze when Marcus's shadow fell across the papers, then straightened with exaggerated calm, as if they had both simply arrived here at the same time by coincidence. They did not speak. They did not need to. The truth was there in the open case, in the half-empty compartments where something heavier than paper had recently been removed. Marcus felt a fresh surge of anger rise through the cold that still clung to his skin, but beneath it was a deeper, more corrosive realization. The container was already being dismantled, not in a collective decision but in secret, piece by piece, the way a carcass is stripped in the dark so no one sees who took the heart. He closed the case without ceremony and stood there until the other man retreated, muttering something about checking the pumps. When he was alone again, Marcus knelt and examined the remaining contents. The documents told a story even without translation, one of layered ownership and deliberate obfuscation. Shell companies folded into other shell companies, shipping routes that curved through obscure ports before vanishing into code. This was not lost property. It was property that had been hidden, misdirected, and now, inconveniently, rediscovered. By the time he returned to his cabin, he was exhausted beyond anything the storm had inflicted. He wrapped himself in a blanket and lay staring at the ceiling, the near drowning replaying itself in fragments behind his closed eyes. He saw again the way the deck had tilted, the hand between his shoulders, the flash of the rail rushing up to meet him. He wondered who it had been, which face he would no longer be able to trust in daylight. Sleep came fitfully, bringing with it dreams that were less like stories and more like warnings. In one, he stood alone on the deck as the container slid across the metal toward him, its doors yawning open to reveal not gold, but water, pouring out in an endless black torrent that swallowed the ship from the inside. He woke to a new sound, not the storm, but the low murmur of voices raised in hurried argument. It drifted through the walls of his cabin like smoke, carrying with it a sense of urgency that made his heart stutter. He swung his legs out of the bunk and stood, suddenly aware that whatever had begun in the night was not content to remain hidden. The trawler was awake now, and it was not the sea that threatened to tear it apart. Morning arrived without light. It crept into the trawler in the form of motion, a deeper, more deliberate rolling that made every object on board shift as if the ship were breathing unevenly. The argument Marcus had heard upon waking had not ended. It had simply moved, spreading through the corridors and engine room in low, corrosive currents that made the very air taste bitter. Men no longer pretended that everything was normal. The container had become a gravitational center around which every decision now orbited, and gravity was tightening its grip. When Marcus stepped onto the deck, he felt it immediately. The sea had changed its posture. The waves were no longer jagged bursts of violence, but long, heavy swells that lifted the hull high before letting it fall again. A slow, punishing rhythm that wore down metal as surely as it wore down men. The wind had swung around to the north, colder, steadier, the kind that carried storms on its back without bothering to announce them. Captain Calder stood at the rail, one hand braced against the rusted steel, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. He did not turn when Marcus approached. His shoulders sagged with a fatigue that went beyond sleeplessness. It was the weariness of a man who could feel control draining out of his hands and had no idea how to stop it. The container sat where it had since the night before, but it no longer looked like a miracle. It looked like ballast, an immense, malignant weight that did not belong to the trawler's design. The ropes that held it in place had been retied so many times that they resembled a spider's nest of conflicting intentions. Someone had moved the tarpaulin aside again, exposing a corner of the rusted door, as if even the effort of keeping it covered had become too much. A swell rose beneath the ship and carried it upward, higher than any in the past hour. The trawler hung there for an instant, suspended, and then dropped with a sickening lurch. The container shifted. It was not dramatic at first, no crash or shriek of tearing metal. It was a subtle, incremental movement, a creeping slide that might have gone unnoticed on another day. But the men who had been circling it felt the vibration through their boots, felt the weight reassert itself in a new and dangerous way. One of the ropes snapped with a sound like a rifle shot, sending fibers whipping through the air. Marcus moved before his mind had finished registering the danger. He shouted, his voice raw, though he did not know if anyone heard him over the engine and the wind. Hands grabbed at fresh lengths of rope, at hooks, at anything that could be pressed into service as an anchor. The trawler rolled again, and this time the container slid several inches, its bottom edge grinding against the deck in a sound that made teeth ache. Below them, the hull responded to the new imbalance. The ship's natural center of gravity had been altered, dragged sideways by the dead mass that no longer wanted to stay put. The trawler began to yaw, her bow cut in erratic lines through the water, each correction slower and less effective than the last. In the wheelhouse, the compass needle wavered, unable to agree with itself. The sea sensed the weakness and leaned into it. The first wave of the renewed storm struck from the starboard side, not in a clean break but in a thick, slamming wall that threw men off their feet. Water poured over the rail and across the deck, swirling around the base of the container, pooling against its edges as if testing how much it could lift. Marcus saw one of the crew pinned against a crate, his leg trapped awkwardly, his mouth open in a soundless shout that was lost in the wind. Another rope gave way. The container lurched, its corner tearing free of the web that had been restraining it. For a terrifying second it seemed to hover, a massive, indifferent god deciding where to fall. Captain Calder burst from the wheelhouse, his face pale beneath the gray of his beard. He took in the scene in a single sweep of his eyes, the skewed angle of the container, the water sloshing dangerously close to the hatches, the crew scrambling like ants around a dropped stone. He did not need to consult charts or calculations. The truth was written in the pitch of the deck, and the way the sea was beginning to pour into spaces that had been dry only hours before. He raised his voice then, cutting through the chaos with the authority he had been clinging to since the first storm. The order he gave was not one he had ever imagined uttering. It was not a command to secure, to repair, to endure. It was an order to abandon the container. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The words hung in the air, absurd and impossible. Then someone laughed, a sharp, hysterical bark of disbelief. Another man shook his head violently, hands still knotted in rope, his knuckles white with more than cold. They had come too far, suffered too much to let go now. The trawler rolled again, harder this time, and the container shifted another inch. Water poured into the open hold in a gleaming cascade, sluicing across the scattered packages that had not yet been reclaimed. A gold bar slid free of its wrapping and skidded along the deck, vanishing into the gray froth with a sound so small it might have been imagined. The crew's resistance snapped then, but not in the direction Calder had intended. Instead of obeying, several men rushed the container, throwing their weight against it as if they could hold it in place by force of will alone. They braced their boots against the deck, shoulders bowed, faces contorted with effort and desperation. To Marcus, they looked like figures in a nightmare, trying to stop a falling building with their bare hands. He ran to the trapped crewman first, wrenching the crate aside with a strength he did not know he still possessed. The man collapsed against him, sobbing into Marcus's shoulder as the ship pitched beneath them. Marcus shoved him toward the stairwell and turned back just in time to see another wave crest over the rail, a towering green mass that swallowed the men clinging to the container in spray and foam. The container responded like a beast awakening. The surge of water lifted it just enough to overcome the last resistance of the ropes, and it began to slide in earnest now, a slow, grinding inevitability that tore free anything in its path. A hook snapped. A pulley ripped loose from its mount and flew across the deck, striking a bulkhead with a sound like breaking bone. Marcus reached Calder's side as the captain struggled to keep his footing. Their eyes met, and in that moment all the words that had gone unspoken between them since the container had been found were finally understood. This was no longer a question of legality or profit. It was physics, pure and merciless. Calder tried to shout again, but his voice was lost as the storm found its full throat. The wind screamed, a continuous, unbroken sound that flattened everything else. The rain came down not as droplets, but as a solid sheet, turning the deck into a mirror in which the crew's frantic movements were reflected in warped, ghostly shapes. One of the men still clinging to the container lost his grip. Marcus saw him slide, saw the sudden terror in his eyes as he realized he was no longer part of anything solid. Marcus lunged, catching his arm just before he went under the steel bulk. The man's weight yanked him forward, and for an instant Marcus was certain he was about to be crushed between the container and the rail. He let go. It was not a decision he made with words. It was something older, a reflex that chose survival over heroism when the two were no longer compatible. The man disappeared from his grasp, swallowed by the chaos of water and metal, and Marcus staggered back, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The trawler groaned in protest, Her entire frame twisted now into a posture it had never been designed to hold. Water poured into the hold in steady streams, and the pumps, valiant but inadequate, could not keep up. Below deck, the engine coughed, a sound Marcus had come to associate with death. Calder found his voice again, or perhaps Marcus only read the order in the shape of his mouth. It was the same command as before, stripped now of any illusion that it might be negotiable. The container had to go. Around them the men were breaking, some in rage, some in despair. One knelt in the water and pounded the deck with his fists as if the steel itself had betrayed him. Another clung to a torn rope, screaming into the storm with a sound that was not language. The container slid another foot, its edge now dangerously close to the rail, its momentum building with each roll of the ship. Marcus moved toward it without thinking, the image of the man he had let go burning behind his eyes. He grabbed a knife from the belt of a crewman who had fallen nearby and slashed at the nearest rope. The blade met resistance and bit through, fibers parting with a satisfying finality that cut through the roar in his head. He moved to the next, then the next, his hands steady despite the water and the cold. Someone struck him then, not hard enough to knock him down, but with enough fury to make the intent unmistakable. He did not turn. He cut again, and another rope gave way. The container lurched violently, tearing free from the last of its moorings, and for a moment it seemed to hang there, poised between deck and sea, a monument to everything they had almost become. The wave that claimed it arrived like judgment. It lifted the container from beneath, carrying it over the rail in a surge of foam and fury that erased it from the ship as if it had never existed. The water closed over it in a single, seamless motion, and the ocean was whole again. The sudden absence of weight was like a breath released after hours of suffocation. The trawler shuddered, then righted itself slightly, the deck rising under their feet with a gratitude that felt almost alive. The storm did not stop. The damage was not undone. But the ship was no longer being dragged sideways into its own grave. Marcus sank to his knees, the knife slipping from his numb fingers. Around him, the crew stared at the empty space where the container had been, their faces stripped of everything but shock. The sea continued to rage, but for the first time since dawn, it no longer felt like an executioner. It felt like a teacher who had finally made his point. The ocean did not pause to honor their sacrifice. The container had vanished beneath the foam, but the storm continued to pound the trawler with the same relentless rhythm, as if offended that its offering had been rejected. The deck was a ruin of broken ropes, scattered cargo, and men who no longer knew whether to curse or to pray. The space where the container had stood gaped like an open wound. Water sluiced freely into the hold, carrying with it the last, mocking remnants of wealth that no one had managed to reclaim. Marcus forced himself to stand, his muscles screaming in protest. The knife lay where it had fallen, half submerged in a puddle that reflected the low clouds like a tarnished mirror. He retrieved it automatically, sliding it back into its sheath, though he could not imagine needing it again. The gesture felt like an attempt to impose order on a world that had just demonstrated how fragile order really was. Around him, the crew was coming apart in different ways. Some stared at the sea with hollow eyes, tracking the imagined path of the container as if they might still glimpse a corner of it between the waves. Others raged, kicking at the scattered boxes that had not yet been swept overboard, their fury seeking an outlet now that its true target was gone. One man knelt at the rail, leaning so far over the water that Marcus feared he would follow the container into the depths if someone did not intervene. The trawler rolled again, less violently than before, but with a stubborn insistence that told them the storm was not finished with them. Without the weight of the container, the ship felt almost light, skittering across the crests instead of being dragged into the troughs, yet the damage remained. The pumps labored in the lower decks, their steady thrum a reminder that time was still being measured in inches of water. Captain Calder stood near the wheelhouse door, his face a study in conflicting emotions, relief warred with grief, authority with helplessness. He looked at Marcus, then away, then back again, as if trying to reconcile a man he had known for years with the one who had just severed the last ties to their imagined future. Marcus did not seek forgiveness. He did not offer explanation. There was no language that could bridge the gulf between what had been lost and what had been preserved. Instead, he moved back into the work that had always defined him, stepping over debris to check the integrity of the nearest hatch, feeling the vibration of the hull through his boots, listening to the cadence of the sea as it battered the ship from every angle. Below deck, the air was thick with the smell of oil and wet metal. The engine room was a cathedral of noise, pistons driving themselves into exhaustion, belts squealing in protest. Marcus ducked beneath a beam and made his way to the pumps, where two men were working with the grim focus of those who had no other choice. Water sloshed around their ankles, cold enough to numb, but they did not slow their efforts. They did not look at Marcus when he joined them, and he did not expect them to. The storm tested them again and again in the hours that followed. Waves rose without warning, slamming into the hull with enough force to rattle tools from shelves and send men stumbling across the deck. Each time the trawler lurched, Marcus felt the echo of the container's absence. The way the ship recovered more quickly now, the way it no longer felt as though an invisible hand were dragging it sideways into oblivion. It was not safety, not yet, but it was the difference between a struggle that could be won and one that had already been decided. At one point, a shout from above cut through the mechanical roar. Marcus climbed the ladder back to the deck and emerged into a world of gray motion. One of the crew lay sprawled near the rail, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle, blood spreading in a thin, bright ribbon across the water-slicked metal. He had been struck by a loose pulley when the last wave hit, the piece of machinery tearing free as the container went overboard. Marcus dropped to his knees beside him, pressing a wad of cloth against the wound with hands that no longer shook. The man's face was a mask of shock, his eyes too wide, his breathing shallow. He had been one of the loudest voices arguing to keep the container, one of the men who had clung to it even as it slid toward the rail. Marcus did not think about that as he worked. He thought only about pressure and pulse, about keeping this broken body attached to life for a few minutes longer. The trawler pitched again, and someone grabbed Marcus from behind to keep him from sliding into the wounded man. For a moment, they were a tangle of limbs and fabric and blood. 3 people held together by the precarious geometry of survival. Then the ship steadied just enough, and they managed to lift the injured man and carry him toward the relative shelter of the corridor. It was there, in the narrow passageway where the noise was muffled to a distant thunder, that Marcus saw the shift. It was not universal. There were still eyes that burned with resentment, mouths set in hard lines of blame, but there were others too, men who looked at him with something that might have been gratitude, or might simply have been the dawning recognition that they were still alive. The storm began to tire itself out toward evening, its fury blunted into a sullen persistence. The waves shortened, their crests collapsing into white water that the trawler could ride rather than fight. The wind slackened just enough to allow speech without shouting, and the radio, silent for most of the day, crackled back to life with fragments of distant voices. They did not cheer when they heard it. The loss was too fresh, the wounds too raw. Instead, they gathered in small groups, tending to each other with the awkward care of men unaccustomed to gentleness. Someone wrapped a blanket around the injured crewman. Someone else produced a bottle of antiseptic that stung and smoked when it touched flesh. The galley filled with the smell of burnt coffee and stale bread, the modest comforts of a world that had nearly slipped away. Marcus stood apart, leaning against a bulkhead, the fatigue finally catching up with him. He felt hollowed out, as if the container had taken something of him with it into the depths. He thought about the moment when he had let go of the man sliding beneath the steel, the way his body had acted before his mind could intervene. He did not know whether the man had survived the fall. The sea did not offer such information freely. The captain approached him then, his boots leaving wet prints that would soon fade into the general dampness of the ship. He did not speak at first. He simply stood beside Marcus, staring out through a porthole at the darkening sea. When he finally turned, his eyes were tired, but clear in a way Marcus had not seen in days. Whatever passed between them did so in silence. There were no apologies, no absolutions. There was only the shared understanding that the trawler was still moving under its own power, that the lights on the control panel still glowed, that the compass needle had found a direction it could commit to. It was not victory. It was reprieve. Night fell again, quieter this time, the storm retreating into a distant rumble that sounded almost like memory. The ship bore the scars of the day, but it bore them upright. Marcus lay in his bunk later, staring at the ceiling as he had the night before. Yet the sound he heard now was not the whisper of betrayal, but the steady, imperfect breathing of a vessel that had been given another chance. He closed his eyes with the image of the container sinking into black water, its contents scattering into a world where money had no meaning. He did not know how he would face the men in the morning, how they would speak of what had been lost and what had been chosen. But he knew this much. When he had cut those ropes, he had chosen something that could not be weighed or sold, and whatever the cost of that choice, it was one he would carry without regret. The ocean did not offer them a farewell. It simply loosened its grip 1 hour at a time, the waves shrinking into tired, disorganized swells that nudged the trawler rather than punishing it. By dawn, the storm had retreated beyond the horizon, leaving behind a gray calm that felt provisional, as if the sea were only pretending to be finished with them. The ship limped forward through it, her engines still alive, her lights still burning, though every vibration carried a memory of how close she had come to breaking apart. No one celebrated the end of the storm. The deck was too ruined for that, strewn with snapped ropes and dented crates, streaked with rust and blood that no amount of scrubbing would ever fully remove. The empty space where the container had stood drew the eye more insistently than any wreckage. It was a scar, not because something valuable had been taken away, but because it marked the place where they had nearly lost themselves. Marcus walked that length of deck slowly, his boots splashing through shallow pools of water that reflected the pale morning light. The air smelled cleaner now, washed of oil and fear by the rain, yet beneath it lingered the metallic tang of damage. Each step sent a dull ache through his legs, a reminder of how much of the night had been spent bracing, lifting, cutting, choosing. He had never felt so tired, not in his body alone, but in the marrow of his thoughts. Below deck, the pumps still throbbed, their rhythm steady and unyielding. They had gained ground during the night, but not enough to relax. Water remained in the lower compartments, hidden in corners that only revealed themselves when the ship rolled just so. The engine room was a cave of steam and shadows, men working in silence to coax life from a machine that had no obligation to continue giving it. The injured crewman lay in one of the narrow cabins, his arm splinted with wood and tape, his face pale against the stained pillow. He was awake, though his eyes drifted in and out of focus as if unwilling to commit to the world just yet. Marcus paused at the doorway, uncertain whether his presence would be welcomed. The man turned his head slightly, the movement small but deliberate, and met Marcus's gaze. There was no accusation there, no gratitude either, only the shared awareness of having passed through something that had stripped them down to essentials. In the galley, breakfast was a quiet affair. The coffee tasted burnt, the bread stale, but they ate anyway because eating was what you did when you were still alive. The conversation that had once filled this cramped space with complaints and gallows humor was gone, replaced by a hush broken only by the clink of mugs and the scrape of cutlery. No one spoke of the container. It lay between them like an unburied body, too heavy to mention yet impossible to ignore. Captain Calder emerged after the meal and gathered them on the deck. The sea behind him was calm enough now to resemble a painting, a flat expanse of gray-blue that could almost be mistaken for peace. He looked older in that light, as if the night had aged him by years rather than hours. When he spoke, his voice carried easily, the wind no longer stealing his words, and the simplicity of what he said cut deeper than any speech he might have prepared. They would make port, he told them, though not their usual one. The trawler needed repairs that could not be postponed, inspections that could not be avoided. The company would have to be informed, the insurance claims filed, the story told in whatever form it would be accepted. There was no mention of what might have been gained, only what remained to be done. The crew listened without interruption. Some stared at the deck, others at the horizon. One man clenched his jaw so hard Marcus could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. Another wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand, a gesture so quick it might have been mistaken for brushing away rain. They were returning with holds that were not much fuller than when they had left, with debts that would not be erased by survival alone. As the trawler drew closer to land, the small, ordinary details of the world began to reassert themselves. A gull appeared overhead, its cry startling in the quiet after the storm. Then another, and another, until the sky was dotted with white shapes that circled the ship with casual entitlement. The smell of earth joined the salt in the air, faint at first, and then unmistakable, a reminder that there was a place where waves broke against something solid and did not immediately reform. The harbor came into view in the early afternoon, a sprawl of cranes and warehouses that looked strangely fragile after the immensity of the sea. Marcus felt his chest tighten as the trawler eased into the channel, the water flattening around her as if in recognition. He had returned from storms before, but never with this particular burden of memory, never with the knowledge that something priceless had been within reach only to be deliberately released. They tied up without ceremony, the ropes thrown and caught with a practiced ease that belied the exhaustion in every limb. Dock workers approached, their movements brisk, their questions routine. How bad was the damage? How many pumps were still running? Had anyone been hurt? The answers were given as required, stripped of drama because drama had no place here. This was not a story that could be told in the language of paperwork. Marcus lingered on the deck after most of the crew had disembarked, watching the tide lap gently against the hull. The trawler looked smaller here, diminished by the proximity of concrete and steel, as if the ocean had been the only thing keeping her proportions honest. He ran his hand along the rail, feeling the roughness where the container had scraped past, the shallow grooves left behind like the tracks of a departing animal. He knew how the coming days would unfold. There would be questions, perhaps even investigations, whispers about what had been found and what had been lost. Some of the men would avoid him, unable to reconcile the life they had almost claimed with the one they now had to resume. Others might speak to him in low voices about the choice he had made, about whether they would have done the same. He did not expect forgiveness, nor did he need it. When he finally stepped onto the dock, the ground felt wrong beneath his feet, too steady, too certain. He walked away from the trawler toward the parking lot where his old truck waited, its paint faded, its bed scarred by years of hauling nets and crates. He unlocked it and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, the silence of the cab pressing in on him. In that silence, he allowed himself, for the first time, to imagine what might have been. The house repaired, the debts paid, the freedom from calculating every purchase, every risk. He pictured the gold bars glinting under artificial light, the watches ticking out a future that would not include this exhaustion. Then he let the images fade, because they were already ghosts, and ghosts had no claim on the living. He thought instead of the moment when the container had slipped into the sea, the way the water had closed over it without hesitation, accepting it back into a realm where human definitions of value did not apply. The ocean had not punished them by taking the cargo. It had punished them by showing them how easily they could have become something unrecognizable. Marcus started the truck and pulled out of the lot, merging into the thin line of traffic that wound away from the harbor. The road ahead was unremarkable, a ribbon of asphalt bordered by warehouses and chain-link fences, yet it felt more honest than any dream he had entertained aboard the trawler. He was returning with nothing that could be counted or insured, but he was returning whole, and for now that was enough. The sea would forget them, he knew. It always did, but he would not forget what it had revealed, not about storms or ships or cargo, but about the fragile, ferocious thing that lived inside men when they believed they were one miracle away from being saved. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapters and new stories coming every week. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of what truly matters, and join us again for more powerful tales you won't want to skip.